Hello friends, my name is Marinés, and this is a one-star review of Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. I'm not offering any other disclaimers up here at the top. I'm just letting you know that you are signing up for a one-star review of Ninth House. There are also spoilers included in this review. I'm not going to talk very extensively or comprehensively about the plot, but as I'm going through and making my points, I will pull out specific things that happen in order to highlight those points. To start, I will say that I picked up this book right when it was published because we all know that the hype was real. I was at PEA in 2019 when obtaining a copy or an arc of Ninth House was like holy grail-ish. Like there was drama around who got copies of Ninth House and people were borrowing each other's copies to take pictures and things like that. So there was definitely a lot of hype in the community about this book. I feel like I have a pretty healthy mix of backlist items and newly published things on my channel in general, but also I read very widely. So I get a lot of comments on my videos like, I haven't read any of the books that you mentioned, or one or two of the books that you've mentioned. So every once in a while, it's just fun to read something that is being super hyped or that a lot of people are excited about or talking about in order to jump into the conversation. That said, my history with Leigh Bardugo is kind of mixed. I've seen her at events in person and she is just very funny and witty and charming. I love to hear her speak on panels. I don't think I've ever met her. I was like standing near Sam when Sam from Thoughts on Tomes met her one time, and that's as close as I've gotten, I think, to meeting her. But on panels and things like that, she is very lovely. I read Shadow and Bone previous to any of that. I think I read it right when I joined the community or even predating this booktube channel. I'm not entirely sure, but I didn't like it. I thought that it was super generic YA of the time. I thought it was pretty badly written. I thought all of the characters were insufferable, and there were some messages about like beauty and things like that that I remember really rubbing me the wrong way. So Shadow and Bone was not for me. I have thought about rereading it, and I think I might have also started rereading it at some point in the last year or so, but I've never gotten around to going back and really solidifying those feelings. I just remember that when I read it, I was underwhelmed. I read Six of Crows definitely during my time here on BookTube, and that book also has problems with pacing and with plot, but it is rescued by a spectacular cast of characters and some really sharp dialogue. It was also one that I read with a lot of people around the time that it was gaining hype, and that was a great experience. So as I said, kind of mixed. Enter Ninth House. This is Bardugo's first adult novel, and in it, 20-year-old Alex Stern is recruited to join Lethe House, which is a secret society at Yale in charge of policing all of the other secret societies, specifically because she can see ghosts. And in Bardugo's world, all of the secret societies are using or involved in magic in some way. I had two false starts with this book. I picked it up on publication day, and I even like made a whole status like, here I go guys, here we go, we're gonna all read this together, it's gonna be great. And then I read about a chapter and I was immediately like, woof, and put it down. I picked it back up again a few weeks later, reread the first chapter, and maybe read like an additional 10 to 15 pages. And I was just so put off by the writing style. It is verbose and overly descriptive. Bardugo smacks you in the face with all of the things that she wants to tell you about Yale, and she leans way too far past atmospheric and description heavy to things that I actually enjoy into pretentious and overwritten. The worst part, especially in the introduction, is that as she's expositing so much that it hurts, she's leaving out the truly useful details. It took me entirely way too long to figure out how Lethe fit into the other secret societies, and that in essence this was a murder mystery kind of story. And I feel confident in saying that that wasn't my fault or any lack of paying attention or understanding. It truly was the writing's fault. And so I complained about this on Goodreads and on Twitter, and multiple people told me to like stick in there because it gets better. One person says after 50 pages it picks up. Another person told me after 100 pages it picks up. I will agree and say that it does get marginally better in terms of it picking up the pace towards the end of the book, but not actually after until we catch up with the prologue. Bardugo starts this book in the way that I now forever associate with Twilight. I'm sorry, but she includes a prologue in which our main character is like fighting for her life. She's battling for her life in some way, and she's like teasing out that something bad has happened and now she's on the brink of death. And then we start chapter 1 back in the past to catch us up to the events of the prologue. So I found that the story doesn't actually pick up until we catch up to the events of the prologue. Once we are at the place where the prologue told us we were going to be, I felt like that was actually when all of the action and plot really were consistent, at least, and took off in a way that it wasn't a chore to slog through. Unfortunately, that was 384 pages later. The other thing about this being so description heavy and overwritten is that it felt like it didn't have enough dialogue, especially because I went into it and that was one thing that I thought Bardugo did especially well, that she wrote all of that fantastic dialogue in Six of Crows. Here it was buried under pounds and pounds of narration, and I also felt like it was stilted. As for the characters, I unfortunately didn't like any of them. I had a really hard time understanding Alex's motivations, especially as the story progresses and she is watching these secret societies just do all of this bad stuff. I understood why she accepted the proposition at the very beginning of the story, why she decides to go to Yale and accept this opportunity. But too often for me, it felt like Alex was idling and like the story was pulling her along. Part of that uneven pacing was that like nothing happened, and Alex was like standing by, and then she would realize something and something would click, something that was usually kind of obvious to us as the reader, and it would be like boom, 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 and then it would idle again. And I know that this is very personal, but in general, Alex as a character put up with more than what I thought was believable. My allowance towards her was really maxed out, and so my sort of empathy and sympathy and understanding of her as a character, Darlington in a lot of ways was the brighter character, which is a problem in and of itself, but we'll get to that later. I felt like he had the better lines, he was a little more witty, a little more quick, but then as the story goes on, you realize that he only exists in the past. This story is told through two different timelines, and all of Darlington's scenes are in the past. We never meet him in the urgency of the immediate plot, so after a while, the fact that he's so removed from the main timeline leaves him feeling a little bit hollow. The two main villains of this story are incredibly transparent. They end up being the two non-cop adults in the story. Both of them are evil, and in the absolute worst twist of all, they both get villain monologues. You literally have to sit there and just listen to them go on and on about their evil ways. We also have Alex's two roommates, and it kind of beats me at this point what the difference is between them. Maybe their hair color, I honestly don't know. Honestly, one of them just exists to get raped and feed Alex's fury later on in the story. There were a bunch of additional characters that populate the secret society, but to me, none of them had any distinguishing characteristics. Bardugo kept naming them. She kept throwing these names at me and expecting me to remember who was who, but she didn't give me any damn reason to remember them. As much as that craft stuff was supremely not for me, I think the thing that took me over the edge of like, this is a bad book that I don't enjoy, into like really angry, was all of the muddled and confused messaging. At first, and when I first heard about this book, I was totally into the premise of secret societies but spooky. In practice though, it was less of that and more that the big ask, the thing that the book is asking you to consider is, what if powerful people did really bad things like harm and abuse the poor and hoard resources and rape and sexually assault women with magic? And so I sat there the entire time that I was reading this, questioning what exactly magic was bringing to the table and what it meant for Bardugo to tell this story, but in no way interrogate the fact that people in power harm and abuse the poor, hoard resources, and rape and sexually abuse women with no magic. If this is a story about surviving abuse and navigating privilege, I absolutely do not understand the ways in which magic were inserted. It's not only enough to ask, through the premise of this book or this story, in what ways would magic benefit those who are already rich and powerful? But Bardugo should have also contended with, in what ways is it problematic, for lack of a better word, to equate real and tangible things like wealth and privilege to magic? I'm not saying that it's impossible to make that equation or to enhance or highlight some of the aspects of privilege with magic, but I don't think that this story did that. It felt like at no point did anybody question the implications of the story that Bardugo was telling. Okay, for instance, Alex is probably biracial. On her mother's side, she is Ladino, and she doesn't know her father, but he is probably Mexican or Central American. We don't know much about that, but I think that it is safe to say, with the information that we do have, that Alex is not white. By making her not white and putting her at the helm of the story, you have dropped her into two really bad tropes. One, lots of the secret societies use magic, but Alex is recruited specifically because she has innate magic. All of the secret societies are doing rituals or taking drugs or things of that nature. Alex can just see ghosts. It is her ability. So in this book full of rich white people, you have this one non-white character, the main character, and you've essentially made her a mystical minority. Two, Alex comes from poverty. She doesn't finish high school, so they recruit her to go to Yale, even though she doesn't have a high school diploma, based solely on the fact that she has this innate ability. I work in talent acquisition. I do a lot of recruiting, and so whenever you're talking about diversity and inclusion and things of that nature, you always get the pushback, always, and I have firsthand experience of this idea that if you are focusing on diversity and inclusion, you will end up with people taking the spots of those who are more deserving. And so by writing the story and making your main character non-white, but then also making her not finish high school but still taking the spot, it was just like a punch in the gut. The fact that she's feeding into this trope of non-white people taking the spot of those who are more deserving. In addition to that, I don't think that Bardugo did a very good job navigating what it would mean for Alex to be attending Yale and the gaps in her knowledge and experience that would result from growing up in poverty and then being inserted into this world. She does touch on it a little bit in regards of like Alex is always hungry and she doesn't have a lot to wear and she struggles in her classes. So there is some of that, but I think that there is like a broader understanding that you would have to have of what gaps in education and just like cultural things Alex would be bringing to this experience at Yale. More than that though, that's kind of like a quibble because she tries. I don't think that this story did remotely enough to address the fact that Alex is a recovering drug addict and she's surrounded throughout the story by all of these secret society drugs. Race and class are also mostly ignored as it pertains to the town outside of Yale, and it's kind of brought up because Tara, the girl who is murdered, and the murder mystery that Alex is ultimately trying to solve is from the town, and you get the sense that her importance is diminished because she is a townie. It kind of sounds like I'm just complaining about all of the things that this book is not, but I feel like the reason that these are issues for me is because they signify gaps in storytelling, and I did not bring them up myself. It's not like I'm just coming up with things and saying, well, she didn't talk about this and it has nothing to do with the story. It's that Bardugo with her story brings them up and then somehow manages not to say anything about these things. So again, for example, in a story where there is an active drug scene, you don't make your main character a recovering drug addict and then say nothing about that. In a story that in some ways seems to be trying to say something about classism and racism, you then don't set it in a real place and then talk about none of the class and race issues of that very real place. I think the story also wanted me to think of Alex as some sort of hero or champion or righter of wrongs. My issue with that isn't even that her justice is gray, like the whole like human poop thing, but that her justice felt uneven, and the people that she was willing to speak up for and the things that she was willing to champion were super uneven. And also it didn't feel like it was coming from like a good place. It felt all very self-centered, and that is fine if Alex's characterization is survivor above all else. Like me first, she's a survivor and that is kind of like her thing. She's not so much looking out for other people, but doing things that are in her own best interest, and if she helps people along the way, so be it. Like, that is a fine characterization for her, except for the story kept paying lip service or saying things that made it feel like they wanted you to see Alex as this champion, this righter of wrongs. Again, it's just all lip service. It's like these little superficial lines addressing misogyny or class or racism or... I read a lot of reviews while struggle bussing through this, and mostly it was out of like frustration. Like I would be reading and I would get angry, and then I would read a 5-star review to try and figure out what I was missing or what it was that people saw in this, to see if I could like reframe how I was reading or my experience. It didn't work. Honestly, it made me angrier. I think the most reoccurring or like consistent thing that I saw throughout the reviews was like love for Darlington as the favorite character. I find that hilarious. And look, I'm not saying that Bardugo had to vilify all of the white men in her story. There were plenty of disgusting white men in the story. I just think that it's really funny that in this story that is trying to talk about like privilege and wealth and class, the character that engendered the most sympathy and empathy and that came across the best to readers by far was the upper middle class white man. In the same vein, in the story full of disgusting white men, the biggest bad, the biggest evil, the person responsible for putting all of the evil wheels in motion for our story is a woman. Are women capable of being evil? Of course. We just don't at all navigate that this entire system of class and wealth and privilege dating back to the 1800s, in which wealthy white men are by far the biggest benefactors, the most vile, evil creature, the one whose soul-sucking magic and disdain, specifically for women of color, started the entire system, was a woman. What a message. I'll end on my final complaint, which is about the depiction of rape and sexual assault in this book. So if you need to skip this bit, please take care of yourself. I've read a couple of things, interviews and things online that have implied that Bardugo herself is a survivor of sexual assault. So I truly believe that she has every right to write her own truth. And I'm not one of those people that think that there is no place for rape in fiction. I happen to be one of those people that thinks that it is very difficult to get right, and ingrained in society in storytelling is this idea that we use rape and it's never truly about the rape victim. It is never about the fallout of that rape, or it is never really about their story. It tends to be about using the rape and framing it around everybody around it. In a lot of ways, rape is used to say like, look at how bad this society is, or look at how dark my story is. There were 2 rapes and a sexual assault in Ninth House. First of all, Alex is raped as a child by a ghost. This is an additional instance in which the addition of magic was like really confusing to me. We are showed a fair amount of how seeing grays, how seeing ghosts affects Alex's life and her mental health, and what it was like being able to see this thing that nobody else could. And I felt like her rape was lumped in with that. Like we were more contending with what it meant for her to have been raped by a ghost than we were with what it meant for her to have been raped. While at Yale, Alex and Darlington attend a secret society party thing to, I don't know, oversee or investigate something, and Darlington is doused with some like magic dust against his will, and it causes him to force himself on Alex. In the moment and following, Alex brushes this off really easily, but the most infuriating thing to me is that I felt like this plot point was used more to gain more sympathy for Darlington because of the way that his consent was violated. And on top of that, I felt like this was the moment that really was kind of revealing or igniting Darlington's sexual attraction to Alex. I read this after some of my friends already had, and I was yelling about it on Twitter, and Deboki from Okie Dokie Boki was like, yeah girl, I had feelings too, and so did Jocelyn from Yogi with a Book. So I started an email chain. I was like, ladies, and they were kind enough to hear me yell. In addition to everything that I yelled on Twitter and everything that I yelled on Goodreads, we like parsed a lot of my like angry feelings out, and Jocelyn shared with me, like she was the first one to kind of put me onto this idea that there were people who ship Alex and Darlington together, and she specifically shared with me some like fan art that was inspired by the scene where Darlington forces himself under the influence of drugs onto Alex, and people were like, ship. A final rape happens to Alex's roommate, and essentially she's given a magical roofie, which is like a roofie but magic. And her rape, a possible gang rape, is recorded on video. We barely hear from the rape victim herself after Alex finds out this is all really a vehicle for Alex to get her magical revenge on. If you've heard any mention of there being the consumption of human fecal matter in the story, that's the magical revenge. The next we hear from the actual rape victim. She's eating a cheeseburger, and it's like a big deal because she didn't have an appetite before on account of being roofied and gang raped. But then Alex gets her revenge, and so the rape victim can eat a cheeseburger now, and she's magically healed, and we never hear from her again. God, this was so stupid. I thought that I was over it. I honestly made this whole big deal about how I was gonna write a review and do a video, but then I was preparing to do my December wrap up, and half of the wrap up was just me having feelings about Ninth House, and I thought I was over it, but I wasn't. I still have all of these feelings about Ninth House, especially because as the end of the year was going on, people were putting this on best of lists. I just kept getting mad. And it's not just that I'm mad that people like this thing that I didn't like. It was people wanting to give Bardugo a cookie for her basic ass handling of class and race and privilege and misogyny. She had one girl power line, and people were yes. How about this? How about in the comments you recommend to anybody else who might be reading, or to me, books that you feel dealt with issues of class and privilege and race and misogyny deftly, and that seamlessly weave those things into the plot by people who seemingly have a better grasp on these complex topics. I'd apologize if you liked this book, but if yelling on the internet about how racist Twilight is for years has taught me anything, it's that my opinion doesn't matter and you probably still like this. I'm kidding. I'm mostly kidding. Even if we had vastly different experiences of this story, I appreciate you sitting through this review, and that is the beauty of fiction, is that we all experience it in a different way. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys soon. Voice for the victim, taking justice into her own hands. Why?